Racist cop shouts at black woman before learning she's the architect of a new federal oversight panel. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. It was an ordinary day in the city, the sun shining brightly above, casting a warm glow on the bustling streets. The sound of cars honking, people chatting, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air as Sarah Johnson made her way to the courthouse. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just another day of getting through her routine. Sarah, a tall, poised woman with sharp features, walked with purpose. Her outfit was simple but elegant, a well-fitted blazer and slacks that exuded confidence without being over the top. As she approached the entrance of the courthouse, she could feel the familiar tension in the air. Today, however, it felt a little more pronounced. A police officer, Officer Mark Davis, stood by the doors, directing people to enter in an orderly fashion. His expression was serious, almost stern. As Sarah walked past him, he eyed her up and down. "What's your business here?" he barked, his tone laced with an unmistakable edge of suspicion. Sarah, who had been walking confidently, paused for a brief moment. She hadn't expected this kind of treatment. She was used to being seen as someone of importance, someone who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. But here, in this moment, she felt the sting of being treated as just another black woman in a world that didn't always value her presence. "I'm just here for a meeting," Sarah replied, her voice calm, measured. "A meeting? You think you can just waltz in here without any identification?" Officer Davis retorted, his voice rising. "Show me some ID." Sarah looked him in the eye, unflinching. She didn't respond immediately. The crowd around them had begun to take notice, whispers rippling through the bystanders. "Is there a problem?" One person muttered under their breath. "She's probably just a visitor," another added. But Officer Davis was relentless. He stepped closer, demanding once again, "Your ID now." Sarah remained composed, though the tension in her chest grew tighter. She had dealt with this kind of behavior before, and yet it never got any easier. But as she reached into her bag, something shifted in the air. A woman passing by stopped and looked over, her gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she pulled out her identification card, one that not just anyone could possess. She handed it over to Officer Davis, who glanced down at it, his eyes widening with disbelief. "What?" he began, but his voice trailed off as he processed the information. The card was official, issued by the federal government. It wasn't just any ID, it was a badge of authority. "You're the architect of the new federal oversight panel," Officer Davis muttered, his voice faltering. I didn't know." Sarah didn't say anything in return. She simply nodded, her expression unchanged. There was no need for words. The truth was right there, and now everyone could see it. The air around them seemed to freeze for a moment as the realization set in. Officer Davis, once so confident in his position, now stood a loss for words, completely exposed in front of a crowd that had been watching the entire scene unfold. In that moment, Sarah's silence spoke volumes. The power dynamics had shifted. She wasn't just a woman being humiliated by an officer. She was someone with authority, someone who would ensure justice was served. The officer's earlier aggression felt hollow now, his harsh words ringing in his ears like a bitter echo. He had no idea who he was dealing with, but now he did. The realization hit Officer Mark Davis like a wave crashing against a solid rock. The confidence that had once been so ingrained in his posture wavered, and for the first time that day, his facade began to crumble. He stared at Sarah Johnson's federal identification card, unable to process the truth. Sarah, standing before him, remained calm and composed, as if she were entirely unaffected by the chaos swirling around them. In the brief silence that followed, the murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, their eyes darting between Sarah and the officer. It was as if the entire scene had shifted in an instant. Officer Davis's voice faltered, and for a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say next. His gaze dropped to the card once again, as if he were trying to make sense of the truth that was staring him in the face. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I had no idea," he muttered, his voice quieter now. Sarah said nothing. She simply stood there, her expression unchanged, as if the entire interaction had already been processed in her mind. It wasn't anger that flickered behind her calm demeanor, but something far more powerful: control. The crowd, once watching with a mix of curiosity and judgment, now shifted uncomfortably as they realized what had just occurred. Sarah wasn't just a bystander in this situation. She was someone with power, someone who had the authority to change the course of the narrative. The officer's earlier aggression seemed almost childish in comparison to the revelation that she was a key figure in the new federal oversight panel. The air around them felt thick, heavy with the weight of the moment. Officer Davis, still processing the situation, hesitated before he spoke again. "I'm sorry," he said, though the apology felt hollow. Sarah could feel the insincerity dripping from his words, but she didn't need his apology. What she needed was something far more important: respect. And respect, she knew, wasn't going to come from someone like him without a significant shift in power. She took a slow, deliberate step back, adjusting her blazer as she glanced around at the growing crowd. It was clear that the situation had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding. Sarah knew exactly what to do next. With a calm but firm voice, she spoke, her words carrying weight as they cut through the tension. "You've just witnessed what happens when power is misused," she said, her eyes locked on Officer Davis. "And now, you'll witness what happens when the system corrects itself." There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just an unwavering certainty that justice would prevail. As she turned to walk toward the courthouse entrance, Officer Davis remained frozen in place, his earlier bravado completely stripped away. The onlookers stood in silence, absorbing the impact of the moment. Sarah had just shown them what true authority looked like, not the kind that comes from a badge or a uniform, but the kind that comes from a truth. She knew that this moment would be remembered, that the impact of her calm response would ripple through the community long after the crowd had dispersed. Inside the courthouse, Sarah didn't need to say much. Her actions had already spoken louder than words. Her presence, her position on the new federal oversight panel, and the events that had just unfolded outside had already set the stage for what was to come. Sarah Johnson wasn't just a passive observer of injustice. She was a force for change, and no one could take that away from her. As Sarah entered the courthouse, the weight of the situation still hung in the air. The encounter outside with Officer Mark Davis had sent ripples throughout the building. People had witnessed the shift in power, and they could feel the tension lingering in the halls. Sarah moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floors, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the calm assurance in her every step. She wasn't just here to attend a meeting anymore. She was here to make a statement. Her mind raced, but only for a moment. She had been through this before, feeling the weight of an unfair system, of people who thought their authority could not be challenged. But now, she was the one in charge. As Sarah made her way through the courthouse, she could sense the eyes of the staff, the attorneys, and even the judges on her. They all knew who she was now. She had earned her place in this world, and it was her quiet strength, not her title, that commanded respect. The hallway was filled with people going about their work, but when Sarah walked by, there was a shift. Conversations paused, and some people stood a little straighter. Her reputation preceded her, and though they had just seen her humiliated by a racist officer, it was clear now that she was a force to be reckoned with. At the end of the hallway, Sarah entered a large conference room where a federal oversight panel meeting was about to begin. She wasn't just a member of this panel. She had been a driving force behind its creation. The room was filled with high-ranking officials, all of them sitting around a long, polished table. Sarah took her seat at the head of the table, her presence demanding attention. She didn't need to speak immediately. The room had already fallen into a quiet reverence. As the meeting began, Sarah could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she kept her focus. The panel had been established to bring accountability to agencies that had long been untouchable, and today, Sarah was here to lay out the next steps. The discussions ranged from policy changes to enforcement strategies, but Sarah's mind was elsewhere for a moment. She was thinking about the events outside with Officer Davis, about how one moment of public humiliation had led to a complete shift in the balance of power. She had faced countless challenges in her career, but this one felt different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for change from the inside. She was demonstrating it to the world. The meeting continued, but Sarah knew that the real change would come not from the policies they discussed, but from the examples they set. It wasn't enough to change the rules. They had to change the way people thought, the way they saw each other. The moment outside the courthouse was a catalyst, but it was just the beginning. The power she had displayed, not through force but through calm authority, would resonate far beyond this room. As the meeting adjourned and the officials began to file out, Sarah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had just turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful message. She had shown that justice was not something to be feared, nor something to be handed down from on high. It was something that came from within, from standing tall and making your voice heard. And as Sarah stood up, ready to leave the room, she knew that this was only the beginning of the change that was coming. She had taken her first step toward a future where the power to bring about real change was not defined by titles or uniforms, but by the strength to do what was right. The days following Sarah's encounter with Officer Mark Davis were filled with a growing sense of anticipation. As the federal oversight panel moved forward with its mission, Sarah became more resolute in her determination to bring about real change. She knew the task ahead was monumental, but for the first time in a long while, she felt as though the winds of change were truly at her back. That morning, as Sarah walked into her office, her thoughts were focused on the upcoming meeting. It wasn't just any regular session. This was the moment when the new policies they had been discussing would be put into action. These policies, designed to bring transparency and accountability to law enforcement agencies, were about to be unveiled to the public. Sarah took her seat at the head of the table. As usual, her presence commanding respect. The room was filled with top officials and experts who had been working alongside her for months. They were ready to share their findings and present the strategies that would bring about the accountability they had promised. The discussions began, and Sarah listened intently, her mind racing as she thought about the implications of each policy. She had been in rooms like this before, but today felt different. She wasn't just listening as a participant. She was listening as someone who had the power to make these ideas a reality. As the meeting went on, Sarah felt the weight of her responsibility. She wasn't just the architect of these policies. She was the one who would see them through. She had fought hard to get to this point, and now the world was watching. Outside the room, the media was waiting for a statement, eager to hear what the panel had to say about the changes that were coming. The meeting lasted for hours, but as the final discussions wrapped up, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. The plans were solid, the strategies well thought out, and the support from the team unwavering. She stood up and addressed the room. "This is more than just a set of policies," she began, her voice calm but firm. "This is about accountability. This is about ensuring that no one, no agency is above the law. We are here to restore trust, to ensure that every citizen, no matter their race, gender, or background, is treated with fairness and dignity." There was a collective nod from the room, as if everyone understood the gravity of what had just been said. Sarah's words carried weight, not because of her position, but because of the truth they held. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, and there would be those who tried to undermine the efforts of the panel. But Sarah was prepared. She had faced adversity her entire life, and this was no different. As the meeting ended, the officials filed out, but Sarah lingered in the room for a moment longer. She gazed out the window, her thoughts drifting to the future. She thought about the people who would benefit from these changes, the people whose voices had been silenced for too long. And then, with a quiet resolve, she turned and walked out of the room. Sarah Johnson wasn't just an architect of change. She was a symbol of it. Her actions, her calm demeanor, and her unwavering belief in justice had set the stage for a new chapter. A chapter where the truth would be heard, where power would be held accountable, and where no one, no matter their title or uniform, could escape the reach of justice. The following weeks were a whirlwind of media attention and public scrutiny. Sarah Johnson had become a household name. What had started as a simple demonstration of authority outside the courthouse had sparked a much larger conversation about justice, accountability, and the balance of power. The media coverage was relentless, with reporters constantly asking for statements, hoping for a soundbite that would carry weight. But Sarah remained calm and composed, sticking to her mission. She knew that every word she spoke would be analyzed, every action scrutinized. But she also knew that this was part of the process. The new federal oversight panel she had helped establish was now at the forefront of national discussions. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about the larger movement for equality and justice. Sarah found herself traveling more than she ever had before. There were meetings with lawmakers, discussions with civil rights leaders, and countless hours spent reviewing case files and testimonies. Each day was a new challenge, but Sarah welcomed it. Her focus never wavered. She was determined to bring about the change she knew was necessary. It wasn't about her. It was about the countless people whose voices had been ignored, whose rights had been trampled. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Sarah found herself sitting in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. She had just finished a video conference with members of the panel when her phone rang. She looked at the screen and saw it was a call from her assistant. Sarah, her assistant's voice was urgent. There's been a development. Officer Mark Davis, he's been reassigned. Sarah sat up straighter, the news hitting her like a jolt. Officer Davis, the very man who had been publicly called out by Sarah weeks ago, had been reassigned? It wasn't a surprise that there would be consequences for his actions, but Sarah hadn't expected this to happen so quickly. Where's he going? Sarah asked, her voice steady, though she couldn't hide the curiosity. They're moving him to a desk job, the assistant replied. He's still on the force, but he's been removed from any direct interactions with the public. Sarah processed the information. This wasn't justice, not yet. It was a temporary solution, a way to remove the immediate threat, but it didn't address the larger issue at hand. Officer Davis wasn't the only one who needed accountability. He was part of a system that allowed his actions to happen in the first place. Sarah knew that her work was far from over. There were deeper issues that needed to be addressed, and she was ready to face them head on. The phone call ended, and Sarah sat in silence for a moment, contemplating everything she had worked for. The fight for justice wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed people like Officer Davis to act with impunity. The next day, she was back in action. She met with a group of reform advocates who were pushing for more comprehensive police training, accountability measures, and civilian oversight. These were the people who would help push the changes Sarah had started. As she sat in the meeting room, listening to the proposals, she couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. The momentum was on their side, and she was right where she needed to be. We are not just pushing for policy change, Sarah said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. We are pushing for a new way of thinking, a way that holds everyone accountable, no matter their title or position. This isn't about taking down individuals. It's about changing the culture of the system itself. The room fell silent for a moment, and then one by one, the advocates nodded in agreement. Sarah knew they were all in this together. They had a long road ahead of them, but it was a road worth traveling. Each step forward was a step toward a more just and fair system for everyone. Sarah Johnson had started a revolution, not with anger or violence, but with calm resolve and a deep commitment to fairness. And in that quiet, steady way, she was changing the world. Months passed, and Sarah's work continued to gain momentum. The Federal Oversight Panel, which had started as an idea she had pushed for in quiet meetings and behind closed doors, was now a well-known entity in public discourse. News outlets were reporting on it regularly, civil rights groups were backing it, and even government officials who had once been reluctant to support it now saw its necessity. Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction, But it was not the kind of satisfaction that came from recognition or success. It was a quiet, internal acknowledgement that the seeds she had planted were finally beginning to bear fruit. The battle was far from over, but the progress they had made felt tangible. Every meeting, every conversation, and every policy they implemented brought them one step closer to the vision she had for a more just system. One afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in a small conference room, the walls lined with large windows that offered a view of the bustling city below. The room was filled with law enforcement officers, civil rights advocates, and policymakers. They had gathered to discuss the next steps in the implementation of the new oversight measures. Sarah sat at the head of the table, as always, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the weight of the discussions about to take place. There were still challenges ahead. The opposition had not disappeared. There were still those who believed that the old systems worked just fine, that the balance of power didn't need to be disrupted. But Sarah knew better. She knew that change was never easy. It wasn't meant to be. "We are at a critical juncture," Sarah began, her voice steady and confident. "This is where the rubber meets the road. The policies we've put in place are not just about policing. They're about the future of this nation. They're about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are or where they come from, is treated with dignity and respect." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was complete silence. The room was listening. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This was about creating a culture of accountability, a culture where the actions of those in power were scrutinized, not because of bias or personal vendettas, but because it was the right thing to do. As the discussion continued, Sarah could see the resistance in the room. Some officers looked uncomfortable, others skeptical, but the dialogue was honest. It was raw. This was the kind of conversation that needed to happen if real progress was to be made. By the end of the meeting, Sarah felt that something had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. The seeds of understanding had been planted. Those who had resisted now saw the importance of the work they were doing. The trust, while still fragile, was beginning to form. When the meeting ended, Sarah remained in the room for a moment longer, reflecting on the discussions. The challenges were far from over, but she knew that they were headed in the right direction. The journey ahead would require patience, perseverance, and unwavering commitment. But she was ready. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The world was changing, and she was a part of that change. It wasn't just about one victory or one policy. It was about building something sustainable, something that would last. She wasn't done yet. Sarah knew that the road ahead would be long, and there would be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Real change was possible, and it was happening now. As Sarah moved forward with the federal oversight panel, the challenges she faced became more complex. It wasn't just about implementing new policies anymore. It was about overcoming years of entrenched systems that resisted change. Every step she took, no matter how small, seemed to be met with opposition. But Sarah wasn't discouraged. If anything, the obstacles only fueled her determination. The meetings had become more intense, with stakeholders from various sectors weighing in. There were those who supported the panel's initiatives, but there were still those who saw it as a threat to the status quo. Sarah had always been aware that change would be difficult, but she hadn't fully anticipated just how entrenched the opposition would be. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her office reviewing reports, her phone rang. It was a familiar number, the head of the Department of Justice. "Sarah, I need you in Washington for a special session," the voice on the other end said. "There's been a development." Sarah's mind raced. A special session? She knew this wasn't just another routine meeting. Something big was happening, and she needed to be there. "I'll be on the next flight," Sarah responded, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Within hours, Sarah was on a flight to Washington, her thoughts racing with questions. What was the development that needed her attention? Was it related to the recent pushback from law enforcement officers? Or was there something more? As she sat on the plane, she reflected on how far she had come. It seemed like only yesterday she had been an unknown figure, quietly working behind the scenes. Now, she was at the center of a nationwide conversation about justice and accountability. It was a surreal experience. When Sarah arrived at the Department of Justice headquarters, she was escorted to a private meeting room. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Several high-ranking officials were already seated at the table, including the Attorney General. Sarah took her seat, and the room fell silent. The Attorney General cleared his throat and addressed the group. "We have received a major breakthrough," he began, his voice steady but serious. "There's been a significant shift in public opinion, and several key players in law enforcement have expressed their willingness to support the oversight panel." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. This was the news she had been hoping for, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice measured but firm. The Attorney General hesitated for a moment before responding. "There's still those who are resistant, but this is a major shift. We have a chance to move forward faster than we anticipated." Sarah leaned back in her chair, absorbing the information. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for, but it was clear that the fight wasn't over. The road ahead was still filled with challenges, and she would need to stay vigilant. "We'll proceed with caution," Sarah said, her tone unwavering. "We can't let our guard down, not now. We've come too far to let resistance slow us down." The room nodded in agreement, the weight of Sarah's words settling in. The panel's work was just beginning, and Sarah knew that every victory, no matter how small, would come with its own set of hurdles. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of optimism. The public support was growing, and the resistance within law enforcement was starting to wane. It wasn't going to be easy, but Sarah was ready for whatever came next. She had spent years fighting for justice, and now, with the momentum behind her, she knew she was on the verge of something truly transformative. As the meeting concluded, Sarah stood up and made her way to the door. Her mind was already focused on the next steps. There was no time to waste. The work ahead was too important. And Sarah, with all the resilience she had built over the years, was more determined than ever to see this through to the end. Weeks passed, and the progress Sarah had been working toward began to take a more visible shape. The momentum she had fought so hard for was becoming undeniable. The public support continued to grow, and Sarah's quiet leadership was becoming a symbol of the changes sweeping across the country. The Federal Oversight Panel was no longer just an idea or a set of policies. It had become a force that was beginning to reshape the way law enforcement operated. But Sarah knew that the work was far from finished. Every victory brought new challenges, and she had learned not to take anything for granted. One afternoon, Sarah found herself in yet another meeting, this time with a group of influential legislators who had long been hesitant to support the changes she was pushing for. The room was filled with high-ranking officials from both parties, and the atmosphere was tense. This was a pivotal moment. The panel's policies had proven successful in several test cases, and now it was time to push for broader implementation. Sarah stood at the front of the room, poised and confident, but her mind was already running ahead. She had prepared for this moment, anticipated the pushback, and refined her arguments. As she spoke, her words were carefully chosen, every sentence crafted to sway those in the room. "We are at a crossroads," Sarah said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "What we do here will set the tone for generations to come. This isn't just about a set of policies. It's about the future of justice in our country. It's about ensuring that every citizen, regardless of their background or the color of their skin, can trust that they will be treated with fairness." The room was silent as Sarah's words hung in the air. She could see some faces softening, others still skeptical, but no one spoke out. This was the moment of truth. Sarah continued, her voice steady and unwavering. "The changes we are proposing are not just necessary. They are long overdue. We are building a system that holds everyone accountable. No one should be above the law, not a police officer, not a politician, not anyone. We cannot allow the mistakes of the past to dictate the future of this country." As she spoke, Sarah's mind flashed back to the countless moments of resistance she had faced, the moments when people had doubted her, when she had been told that the status quo was too strong to challenge. But now, she stood before these lawmakers, challenging them to choose the future over the past. There was a long pause after her words, and then slowly, One by one, the legislators began to speak. Some offered their support, while others asked questions, seeking clarification on the finer details. Sarah answered each one with poise and knowledge, never once wavering in her belief that the work they were doing was the right thing. By the end of the meeting, there was no outright victory, but Sarah could feel the shift. The support was there, even if it was tentative. The seeds had been planted, and now it was a matter of nurturing them until they could grow. As Sarah left the room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced doubt before, but it no longer fazed her. She had made a difference, and she knew that with each passing day, she was getting closer to the world she envisioned. The world where justice was not a privilege, but a right for all. As she walked down the hallway, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her assistant. The Attorney General wants to meet tomorrow. Urgent. Sarah's thoughts immediately turned to the next challenge. There was always more work to do, more people to convince, more systems to reform. But for the first time in a while, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She was on the right path, and the fight for justice was far from over, but it was a fight worth continuing. The next day, Sarah arrived at the Department of Justice, ready for the meeting with the Attorney General. The anticipation hung heavy in the air as she stepped into the sleek, polished conference room. The Attorney General was already seated at the head of the table, his stern expression belying the gravity of what was to come. Sarah took her seat, her posture as commanding as ever. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," the Attorney General began, his voice low but steady. "I trust you've been briefed on the developments." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I'm aware of the progress," she replied. "But what's the urgency?" The Attorney General's expression tightened slightly. "We've received word that there's a significant pushback coming from certain groups within law enforcement. They're planning a public campaign to discredit the oversight panel, and we need a strategy to counter it." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. She had anticipated this. Resistance was inevitable, but it wouldn't deter her. "What exactly are they planning?" she asked. "They're calling the panel unconstitutional, claiming that it undermines the authority of law enforcement," the Attorney General explained. "They have powerful allies, and they're already beginning to gather support." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "We can't afford to let this go unchallenged," she said firmly. "We need to take action, strong, decisive action." The Attorney General nodded, his eyes reflecting the weight of the situation. "That's why I've called you here. We need you to help lead the charge. You've gained the trust of the public, and now it's time to use that influence." Sarah's mind whirred as she processed the request. She had fought so hard to get to this point, and now the true test was before her. This wasn't just about the policies anymore. This was about ensuring that the panel would be allowed to carry out its work without interference. "I'm ready," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "We'll take their campaign head on. We'll show the public what's at stake, and we'll make it clear that accountability is non-negotiable." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and her team launched a nationwide media campaign to counter the resistance. They held press conferences, conducted interviews, and released statements that laid out the undeniable importance of the panel. But it wasn't just about talking points. It was about showing the public the real-world impact of the panel's work. Sarah knew that it was the stories, the voices of those who had been wronged, that would resonate most with the public. She made sure their stories were front and center in the campaign. With each passing day, the resistance began to lose ground. The more the public understood the purpose of the panel, the less power the opposition had. But Sarah knew this wasn't a fight that could be won with one battle. It was going to take time, persistence, and unwavering commitment. And she was ready for that. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings and media appearances, Sarah sat alone in her office. The city lights outside her window twinkled in the distance, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax. She had made it this far, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew one thing for sure. She was doing the right thing. Sarah had always believed in the power of justice, but now, more than ever, she was living it. The next chapter was beginning, and she was at the forefront, ready to continue the fight. No matter the challenges, no matter the opposition, Sarah Johnson was determined to ensure that justice would prevail. And as she gazed out the window, she felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Sarah was exactly where she needed to be.